Good afternoon, everyone, for the second part of our conference this year, Southeast England Faith Forum Conference. And this afternoon, we are looking at avoiding science. During the pandemic, anti-scientific voices have become more strident on social media, and there have been hate crimes directed at scientists. Avoidance of scientific evidence and reasoning has also become evident as an aspect of vaccine hesitancy and objections to other public health interventions. There has been a troubling overlap between these phenomena and faith-related beliefs, with indications that faith can be used to justify or harden them. So this afternoon session is going to offer us an opportunity to explore the reasons for science avoidance in faith communities and reflect on ways to address the issue. And we have Dr. Joanna Collicutt with us to do that. So very grateful for you once again for joining us. And just a brief background to Dr. Joanna Collicutt. She has studied experimental psychology and later theology at Oxford University, and clinical psychology and later Christianity and the arts at King's College London. She is a chartered clinical psychologist and registered specialist neuropsychologist. After many years working in the British National Health Service, she moved into the field of psychology of religion and was director of the MA programme in psychology of religion at Heathrow College, University of London. Moving back to Oxford in 2010 to take up course as lecturer in psychology and spirituality at Reframing College and older people's advisor for the Diocese of Oxford until 2020. She remains a supernumerary fellow at Harris Manchester College, an associate priest in an Oxfordshire parish, and an honorary canon of Christ Church Cathedral. Her interests are wide-ranging, reflected in publications on positive psychology, brain and behavior, natural theology, psychological and visual approaches to the Bible, psychological trauma, the spirituality of children and people with special needs, theology and death, and medical ethics. That is an introduction to our guest speaker for this afternoon. Over to you, Dr. Joanna Collicutt.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. I'm going to try and do a better job of screen sharing than I did this morning, so we'll just see whether, yeah, that's looking better. So that was the slide I was telling you about this morning, and on it you can see the way I've thought about this issue. And what I'm going to offer you is really just some observations of the complexities involved rather than any answers or even actually any judgment on the rights and wrongs of it. And as the slide says, I'm going to be talking about faith and attitudes to science in a pandemic, a perfect storm. So before the break, I was talking about, it's quite often happens, I'm trying to advance these slides now, if I can. Yeah. 5 influences on the way we find ourselves at the moment. And you can see how messy this slide is with arrows linking all sorts of parts of it. And that is, in a sense, represents the way that these things are not really separate influences, but that they all interrelate. And before the break, I started to talk about aspects of the first 2, the conditions, that is the kind of postmodern culture in which we find ourselves, and yet a culture in which modernity still features very heavily. The threat from the pandemic, and indeed something I haven't mentioned, but is also knocking at the door and has very similar features in terms of attitudes of faith groups, and that's the threat from climate change. And then the pattern that we know that we as human beings, we have a set number of ways that we respond to threat. One of the things about threat and anxiety is that it reduces the kind of range of our behavioural repertoires, and we tend to retreat into quite set ways of thinking and behaving, and ways that are more patterned than when we're relaxed. And so it is fairly easy to delineate these patterns that I've called direct action purity, separation, and escapist fantasy, which kind of parallel facing your fears, defensive aggression, avoidance, or escape strategies that you see in people who are going through clinically severe anxiety episodes. And I then moved on, I mean, this is true of all human beings, but I then moved on to start to flag that there's something about faith communities in which these may be expressed in certain ways. And there's quite a famous psychologist of religion called Kenneth Pargament, who has talked about looking at religion as a means of coping with life, and as offering a number of distinctive ways of coping with life, some of which are better at supporting our well-being and some of which are less good. And the methods that I just talked about, the responses I've just talked about, direct action, purity, separation, and a kind of escapism, map a little really onto what he would call, I guess, first of all, self-directed forms of religious coping, by which he means you try and solve the problem yourself, basically, and then you ask God to rubber stamp what you've decided to do. Or another way of coping, which he describes as deferral approaches, where you kind of stand back and you expect God to do all the work, and you yourself retreat into habitual patterns of religious observance or escapist beliefs. So in one of those, you are taking ultimate control, and in the other, you are passively relinquishing control. And both of those responses, he wouldn't say, the empirical research seems to indicate, are less conducive to well-being than some other ways of responding within your faith tradition, which I'll come on to. But I come on to point 3 now on the slide, which is the information that we have at our disposal, which may consolidate or challenge these different ways of coping. That is the sources. And first of all, we have as a source of information expert institutions, and the role of the scientists in the first part of lockdown in this country, where there was a scientist standing at a podium every day with a different member of government, issuing data and issuing opinions, kind of embodies that in a very visible way. And these expert institutions connect with one aspect of modernity, so going right back to that setting condition, and that is its construction of a new authoritative elite. And this elite has shifted from, in previous centuries, religious authority and a religious elite with its own set of authoritative practices and views and statements, to an elite that is now based around rational thought and empirical data. So there's a very strong shift under the valorizing of rational thought. And before the pandemic, we are ambivalent about this. As I mentioned, there's that Dr. Martin program kind of captures that quite well, but just before the pandemic, or shortly before the pandemic, there's this very famous statement by Michael Gove, whose picture is on the first slide, which is that we've all had enough of experts telling us what to do. And of course, that power balance has shifted again in the light of the pandemic, but it hasn't totally shifted. There's still this unease. There's a distaste for this kind of elite, and there's a resentment at the kind of closed shops that they establish, so which have names like the Royal College of Psychiatrists, for an example. They have their own jargon. They make definitive pronouncements. There's a religious quality to them, but the content is highly rationalist. And of course, although they appear to make definitive pronouncements and talk about facts, it becomes very clear quite quickly that the experts disagree amongst themselves. So there are no definitive facts and definitive courses of action that we would be advised to take. And I mentioned it last time, just before the break, about the way this puts us in a situation of being faced with dilemmas. And you can kind of see that partly in the way the government weighs up the pros and cons of opening up and shutting down. But you can also see it in the way that the scientists themselves will talk confidently about something, and then at some point will say, I'm not going to tell you what to do, that's not my job. That decision has to be made by others. So we might want to push back against this authoritative elite, but they're actually harder to push back against almost than some of those authoritative religious elites, because they turn out to be not so definitive in their knowledge after all, and that can cause us even more anxiety. If we could just hate them for telling us what to do, but have a sense that within themselves they were coherent, life would be a lot simpler. But we see actually there's a lot of nuance going on there, and all the experts give a slightly different angle. And everyone can usually drum up an expert who will give another angle on these things. And then the kind of elite group will say, well, that's an expert, but they're an outlying expert because they're not in our club. And it all becomes much more complex than it at first appears. But that's the kind of, I guess, default go-to place for our knowledge about the pandemic, is to go to expert sources, most of whom are scientists. But alongside that, we have, as we know, direct access to common knowledge, as we have always had, but ramped up hugely through the internet. We do this through our social networks. So we pay attention to anecdotal stories of individuals whom we know and we trust, or appear to be trustworthy, or simply facts that we see out there. And this is unfiltered. We don't have the ability, other than our intuition about whether it feels trustworthy, to know how reliable this information is. And you may recall, and you may have experienced this yourself, that one of the things that most annoys general practitioners, if you go to your own doctor and say, well, I've been on the internet and I know what's wrong with me, there is an opposition between this area of common knowledge and the area of expert elite knowledge, which is a difference in philosophy, a difference in thought, but obviously it's also underpinned by social power structures as well. And within that more common knowledge milieu of the internet, we now have really rapid transmission of information. And playing into that is that we live in what has been called a post-truth culture, where not just an inability to understand the nature of evidence, but actually an inability to be bothered about evidence at all is becoming more common. Perhaps that's why we have the rise of influencers alongside experts, or perhaps in opposition to experts. And it's in that kind of milieu where we have these competing types and sources of information to draw on that religious health beliefs are developed and sustained. Now, in psychology of religion, there has been a little bit of research on religious health beliefs during the pandemic. And one way of just defining what people mean by religious health beliefs when they do this is they place them in a larger construct of paranormal beliefs. And these include all beliefs that exceed the limits of what is deemed to be physically possible according to the prevailing scientific assumptions. They're beliefs that invoke faith, that invoke God or gods or saints and their relics. And they expect these to act as advocates for a prompt recovery, or as protection from illness, or to promote health. And this kind of quality of belief isn't simply in conflict with modernity and rational science. It's also, there's a historical diachronic thing going on here. It's a characteristic of pre-modernity, which I mentioned before the break. So in the West, the medieval world was characterized by these sorts of religious health beliefs, which are now labeled as paranormal. But then that was the dominant, or part of the dominant and universal metaphysic. So what is deemed to be normal and paranormal has changed. And given the fact that we live in this setting where there is a conflict between these sorts of beliefs, religious health beliefs, which many of us will hold, and prevailing scientific assumptions with which we also might wish to take into account, it's likely that we'll be faced with a good deal of cognitive dissonance. That is, ideas that just don't match up and can't be resolved in our heads. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be. And so to maintain our comfort levels, we start to filter the information ourselves, and we do that through cognitive biases. And there's a little bit of research by some Italian researchers that seems to suggest that if you have a high level of existing religious health beliefs, that you are more likely to believe in fake news about COVID. This was research done during the pandemic. Remember, Italy was one of the first places that it hit. And this, by fake news, I mean rumours going around that, for example, if you drink a hot beverage, it will kill COVID if you have it. And I'm going to move on. I'll come back to that research because there's more than simply having a high existing level of religious health beliefs and being prone to believe fake news. To my next point, which is number 4, epistemology, theories of knowledge. And there are at least two key distinctive aspects of religious epistemology that distinguishes it from other ways of thinking. And the first is that in religious thinking, we allow intentional agents to be causes. And that's in contrast to science, which will not invoke them in its explanations. So this is a way of thinking that grants objects agency or posits the existence of invisible agents, such as gremlins. And that way of thinking is very natural to all of us, and we all do it all of the time, no matter how highly educated or sophisticated we are. We do it when we talk about the photocopier as out to get us, or we treat the COVID virus as a personal enemy that is set to destroy us. And in the field of cognitive science of religion, there's been a lot of research which has culminated really in an account that there are good reasons that we tend to think in these ways from an evolutionary perspective. We tend to attribute agency to things that, rationally speaking, are not agents. And this tendency piggybacks on more rational theology to give a lot of religion its personal plausibility to us. If we want to do science, and again, there's lots of research on this, we have to intentionally educate ourselves out of that way of thinking. It doesn't come naturally to us. We have to think in an unnatural way. And all of this together suggests that our typical ways of thinking when we're thinking in a religious mode are quite different from the ways we need to think about when we're doing science. And that brings them potentially into conflict with each other, though we manage it most of the time. But under conditions of stress, our tendency to revert to the more natural ways of thinking is intensified, and that gulf widens. The other aspect of religious thinking that is quite distinctive is not so much its form, but what it's based on. And this is to do with its reliance on its own texts and its traditions as the ultimate authority that trump all other sources of authority, what is often called intra-textuality. So you believe, as it were, within your own bubble that you have intentionally created, rather than intertextuality, where you draw in insights from outside it. And you can see on the slide from the arrows that I've drawn in there, that intratextuality and the tendency to intratextuality, because there's a kind of, there are degrees of intratextuality, is connected with that tendency to retreat and to nostalgia and to escapism. Because increasing intratextuality is one way of managing cognitive dissonance. So what you do is you have a certain health belief. It seems to be at odds with other things that are coming out of the scientific community. And what you do is you connect your health beliefs to your sacred text or a particular reading of your sacred text. And you find in that reading of your text a way of rejecting or avoiding the other ideas and the whole other worldview sometimes. And you find a way that the sacred text validates your own existing religious belief and condemns the other. So coming back to belief in fake COVID news, it may be believed because it is in line with existing religious health beliefs. It may also be believed because it feels more naturally plausible, because it invokes agents very often who can be blamed. And of course, blaming somebody or something is one way that we manage our disorientation when we're in a situation of uncertainty and threat. So the agent may be the personalized COVID virus, but it may be larger organizations, governments, doctors, hostile nations, the laboratory in Wuhan. Those may objectively be more or less to blame for all sorts of things, but part of that openness to fake news, which has these kind of theories of conspiracy that are behind what's going on, is that they're a way of managing our anxiety. They're a way that is consonant with our tendency to think in terms of agents and causes, rather than stuff just happening and not being able to explain it. And then on top of this, and this is where the intratextuality comes in, we can then consolidate and validate those feelings, which are intuitively plausible, by pointing to a sacred text or tradition and saying, aha, well, this indicates, in fact, this is all true. And then it's a separate question as to whether in doing that we are faithfully interpreting our sacred texts and traditions, or whether we are misusing them. And you then move into this kind of grey area between psychological science and theological questions and philosophical questions. And then finally, forms of faith, which I'm starting to touch on already, because I've said that intratextuality, there are degrees of intratextuality. There are degrees of how much we engage with purity and separation, and retreat and escapism, and so on. And I've already mentioned the psychologist of religion, Kenneth Pargament, who has talked about these forms of coping where you either defer to God or you self-direct and then just ask God to rub a stamp. And then he also talks about other ways of religious coping that seem to be more associated with good outcomes in terms of well-being. And the first of these is what he calls collaborative coping, where you work intentionally with your God, that in prayer you wrestle, you engage, you ask God to help you in your approach to problem solving the threat. So you're not doing it yourself and just saying, this is a religious way to do it. You're not saying there's nothing I can do, God holds it all in God's hands, but you're somehow coming together with God. And then something much more subtle, which on the surface may look like deferral coping. It may look very passive, but in fact is an active surrender to the divine, which is psychologically rather different, where you choose to place yourself in a position of powerlessness, psychologically or socially, as a spiritual discipline. And so the forms of religious coping that seem to be, to use a value judgment, more healthy are the more subtle and nuanced ones. So coming on to forms of faith then, as on the slide, and the sorts of things that may contribute to this skepticism and avoidance of science, and then indeed vaccine hesitancy. There are first of all the ways people think, and then there are social and social psychological factors. There's been loads and loads of work in psychology of religion on something called fundamentalist thinking, which is not the same as by any means, but is linked with another psychological quality called authoritarianism. And authoritarianism is a feature of some faith groups. It seems to be, and that's why I have a picture of Donald Trump on my first slide, seems to be a distinctive feature of Trump voters in the last election and in the previous election in the USA, and particularly seems to be the thing that brokers the association of certain evangelical Christian groups with very right-wing Trumpian ideology. But fundamentalist thinking is something a little bit different, and it's nothing to do with what you believe. Well, not with your core theology. It's much more to do with how you hold your beliefs. So fundamentalist thinking is, and I'm going to just quote this because it has a quite a technical meaning. The belief that there is one set of religious teachings that clearly contains the fundamental, basic, intrinsic, essential, inerrant truth about humanity and the deity. That this essential truth is fundamentally opposed by forces of evil, which must be vigorously fought. That this truth must be followed today according to the fundamental, unchangeable practices of the past, and that those who believe and follow these fundamental teachings have a special relationship with the deity. So what they're trying to do there is to get away from the content of your faith belief, your particular faith tradition, and look at the form in which you hold your beliefs. And it's clear from that definition, and there are psychometrics based on it, on which a lot of work has been done, that people here are conceiving fundamentalist thinking as inherently oppositional in form. There's us and there's them. There's those who are in and those who are out. And there's very little room for grey areas. And it's not just that we're in and they're out, but that we have a monopoly on truth, and it is our job to assert this truth. And I have said in other contexts that if you look at that kind of definition of fundamentalism, you could equally apply it to forms of atheism, actually forms of liberalism, I think, as well, with a little bit of tweaking. And this oppositional aspect of fundamentalist thinking relates also to the social nature of certain forms of faith. So we heard this morning, and it's predominantly the case, the great resources of faith traditions are the social cohesion and support and networks and meaning frameworks that they offer their members. But there is also a potential dark side to that, to do with tribalism and excessive sectarianism. And this fundamentalist type of thinking occurs in contexts where the tribal aspects of a faith are particularly prominent. So going back to that research from this Italian group that I mentioned earlier, they found that not only pre-existing religious health beliefs predicted the likelihood of believing fake COVID news, also the social tribal aspects of religiosity predicted this. So where people held to a faith that was very much defined in I belong to this group, and it's all about social cohesion, there was more of a tendency to believe fake COVID news. And where the form that religion took was slightly more individual and involved with what we might be called spiritual, personal practices, there was much less of a tendency to believe in fake COVID news. And perhaps some of that is to do with the fact that being science avoidant can, or being science skeptical, can actually become a tribal identity marker. You belong to this faith group, and what goes with it is scientific skepticism. That's how one way we know you're in. And the costly signaling, to use another technical term that is involved, which is a bit like virtue signaling, to mark your purity would be refraining from vaccination, because this is the physical embodiment of this science skepticism. So that may be one reason, or part of why all these things seem to be interconnected. And then the final thing I would say about tribalism is that and fundamentalist thinking is that these things are intensified in situations of social oppression. So at the beginning, before lunch, I was talking about how interested I was to start to study first century Israel-Palestine at the time of Christ, where basically most of the population were deeply socially oppressed. And a lot of the thinking looks quite sectarian and fundamentalist in form. And it can be intensified by a narrative of oppression as well. And that, of course, leads to increased mistrust, not just in elites who are seen to be scientific elites, but in political elites who form alliances with them. And certainly, I think some of the vaccine hesitancy in the United States among certain ethnic groups is based on a clear history of social oppression. So there you get culture, ethnicity, and faith coming together to feed even more hesitancy. So what I've offered is analysis, if you like, of some of the complexities that seem to be at work. And of course, as soon as you see how complex it is, the question of what might you do about it to perhaps help us liberate ourselves from some of these things raises its head, and it's obvious that there is no simple answer. And I certainly have not presented any answers, but I thought this might be quite a good basis for reflection and more practical discussion. So thank you. I'll unshare now.
Thank you, Joanna. Have you finished your talk now?
I have finished my talk, yes.
Thank you.
So I'm very happy to take questions, or
questions.
if you want to facilitate discussion, that's fine.
Sure. David and Emil, do you have any questions?
No, but there were a couple of suggestions by Pete Baldwin. He's suggesting there is this scientist, that scientist looking into that, and their work were denounced. I don't know if they are the domain of this talk. I think we need to allow Joanna to be asked questions about her presentation. May I actually start by saying it's an excellent presentation. Thank you, Joanna. And in Slough, we have a massive mix of different cultures. And as you heard in the previous presentation, One Slough initiative was trying to get everyone to be a part of it, to be vaccinated, to be taking precautions. And we were trying to reach hard to reach communities. I think the essence of your presentation is about that social tribalism you were talking about, and collaborative thinking. Certain groups, the more pressure you put on them, the more resistant they became. And there were particular cultures who were advised not to be vaccinated because if they are going to be ill, it would be the God's punishment for them, or it would be God's choice to make them ill. And who are they as individuals to go against the God's will? Mm. So that was a really difficult area for us to cope with. From that perspective, I am very interested in your work, and it would be lovely to have your presentation to share with the others who are not here. I wish they stayed. And I do understand the narratives in there, but was there any work with individuals? I wondered.
No, I think just to pick up your first point, I think what you've described is, about this retrenchment of position if you press people too far. I'm sure everybody has found that, and you have to tread incredibly carefully and to understand that there's more than one factor. It's not that people are stupid or irrational, that they actually have a whole other set of social and psychological factors that are pressing on them. And one of the things about getting vaccinated is it's an action that you take, and our default setting when we're in these dilemmas is to do nothing. So you're asking people to step, and if I do nothing and something bad happens to me, then well, but that God did that, and that's fate. If I've done something and something bad happens to me, we all have a tendency then to blame ourselves. And then if your social group has reified that kind of what is actually a cognitive bias into a teaching, then it's very hard to push against. And to go to your question, which is, has much work been done on individuals? I think it's starting to be done, but we're so kind of early on that I certainly haven't seen it yet. So the one study that I was quoting was done, it was done on groups, and it was done with questionnaires rather than in-depth interviews, though I know that work is going on.
Yes, thank you. One of the things that I personally so dislike is the term hard to reach communities that I used myself to be just as a descriptive. And all these initiatives, all these cohesion work doesn't mean if the communities don't want to be reached. There are pockets of communities who remain within those pockets, and if they want to, if they they don't want to be known, found out, then you cannot do much about it. And our approach was finding the leaders of those communities, talking with them. Obviously, the disadvantage of that was physical meetings stopped. Yeah. Churches or sacred spaces were closed. So the leaders couldn't reach to those people. For instance, Sikh groups are really active in their physical life, but with lockdown, they couldn't go to their gurdwaras and they couldn't pass the messages. So it was, if we were trying to establish Zoom meetings and etc., which was almost impossible. Anyway, I don't want to take over.
Trust, first of all, faith is very embodied thing, and interpersonal trust is embodied. And if you can't actually see the body of the person who's asking you to do something costly, then it's just another barrier, as you've put really clearly. So yeah, thank you. There was something else I was going to say. It'll come back to me shortly, but I know what it was. It was the hard to reach. There's something weirdly evangelistic or colonial about that kind of expression, isn't there? There's people trapped in darkest somewhere who need the light bringing to them, which is unfortunate, to say the least.
For which I apologize, just a descriptive for this group.
Thank you, Emil. David, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. We at Slough Faith Partnership have humanists on our committee, and so I was interested in you're mentioning the way people who are non-believers also react. And we have found that among humanists, there are science deniers, although as a group, and even as individuals within the group, they advance the use of science very critically. So, but that they will be anti-vax. We find completely different views within that group on wearing masks, for example, and each one backed up by a scientific, supposedly scientific research. So wearing a mask is not effective. It actually helps transmit the disease, or wearing a mask is effective, and but it's only effective in preventing other people catching the disease if you're carrying it. So, but this, of course, is without any reference to the the deity, the higher form that you have to conform to. So, who are they trying to conform to, and what is the what should we say, the lever at work there?
I mean, the way you describe it, it sounds awfully like some Christian groups that I belong to, where everybody says they believe the Bible, but they all, and hold it in the highest regard and refer everything to it, but they all come out with different opinions on what you should actually do, which they're able to justify by their own sacred text, or let's say more broadly, canon. There's probably some kind of implicit canons that are going on in humanist communities, even in the, maybe not so much in the scientific community, but in the clinical medical community, you have also kind of sacred canons. So you have seminal papers, which people quote without actually having gone back and read, or particular practices in medicine. And every so often medicine, you know, has a kind of clear out and realizes that some of the things it's doing have no evidence, but have been done for years on the basis of the fact that somebody important wrote a paper that was thought to demonstrate that this should be the case, and in fact, when you know, scrutinized, turns out not to have been the case. So there's some kind of pattern of thinking that is not just, it's a kind of, I think it is a religious pattern of thinking, but it's not confined to religious groups or groups that we conventionally call religious. And then you've raised the question of, to be religious, does a group have to have a transcendent reference? You know, is it something about connection with some supernatural or ultimate agency that gives this its authority? And I suppose, I mean, I haven't thought about it enough, but I suppose what I'm saying about modernity is that somehow we've cut loose from that, and we have a different kind, we have an authority that has a similar form to religious authority, but it stops short of that transcendent referent. And I don't know what difference that makes. Surprisingly little, perhaps, because I think a lot of what goes on in religion also doesn't have a transcendent referent, that people are going through the motions. And maybe that underpins the hunger for spirituality that we have in our culture, that people are wanting something more that has, in their perception, a genuine connection with the transcendent other, or however we conceive of the divine.
Thank you.
Yes,
There's a
thank you.
question from Stephen. I've seen cartoons from Edward Jenner's time which made fun of vaccination. Is the percentage of doubters uniform across time and across states?
I don't know. I mean, other people may know. I don't know the empirical research on that. My prediction would be that none of us like having a needle pressed into, and it's not to do with the pain. I mean, when people say, oh, it didn't hurt a bit, it doesn't hurt anyway very much, but it's nothing to do with that. It's to do with, without sounding, that meaning even to be very Freudian, it's to do with the penetration of the boundaries of the body. And there is, and that has oddly a connection with tribalism, because in groups that who are under threat, there's a very much more of a tendency to police the boundaries of the group in all sorts of ways. And there's something, certainly if you believe the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who's the person who's done all this work on pollution that I mentioned, and some of you will have already come across, she talks about the physical body being a microcosm of the community. And at times of anxiety, people get very anxious about the boundaries of the physical body as well, because it carries with it kind of meaning and symbolism about the boundaries of the tribe. And so to let a foreign body into your own body is asking symbolically, it's asking an awful lot of people. And those of us who just go, if you can reframe it, and this is the great thing that psychology, I think, Insight has offered through things like cognitive therapy, if you can reframe what you're doing so that the kinds of symbols and images that make it appear unfaithful to your tradition or a personal threat in some way are replaced by others, I think that's when you get most behavior change. So, for example, I really don't like having vaccines. I don't care about the injection. I do wonder what it's doing to my body. I don't think we know lots about it. But I have reframed it to myself as a sacrifice that a person must make for the greater good of society. And then going to get my vaccine becomes a kind of offering to God, because no matter what it may do to me, I'm very likely, rationally speaking, to benefit from it. But the wider benefit of society, to whom I feel committed, so I don't feel I'm part of a sub-persecuted group, I feel connected with the wider society and therefore prepared to put myself at a small degree of perceived risk. So there's a whole lot to do with reframing what you're asking people to do and connecting them with a sense of belonging to, well, investment in the wider culture. And that is a long game for people who may be feeling alienated, often with some justification from the wider culture.
Thank you. There's a question from Ayad. Thank you for a comprehensive picture. Please, can you expand and explain retreat into purity?
Okay, so the purity and the retreat are a little bit different. So the purity is the kind of thing where you ratchet up the boundary conditions by rituals around cleanliness. And the cleanliness can be physical cleanliness, or it could be intellectual cleanliness. So you don't have impure thoughts or beliefs in your group. And what I've been suggesting is that people tend to be rather more relaxed about these things when conditions are favorable. But one way they respond to stress is to become more concerned with them. So the clinical analog of that would be the kind of hand washing you see in obsessive compulsive disorder. And the kind of excessive focus on cleanliness. So one thing that was quite interesting, about 6 weeks ago, I went to preach in one of our churches, and the reading that was set was Jesus' argument with the Pharisees about cleanliness. And the argument is that the Pharisees were criticizing Jesus because he didn't wash his hands before eating in the way he was required to do. And Jesus says to them, you know, you're obsessed with purity actually, and you've lost the heart of the faith. But the people in my church were very distressed by this reading, because they said that Jesus comes over sounding like Boris Johnson. It doesn't matter whether you wash your hands or not. And they had been, you know, so inculcated over the last few weeks into months into being aware of cleanliness that they could not see where he was coming from. It was very, very dissonant to the place they had been. So I think the context in which that dialogue happens is around an observation that when you're under threat, you are more attentive to purity within yourself, within the personal body, and within the group. And the analog to that would be something like OCD. When I talk about escapism and fantasy, the analog kind of thinking in clinical terms would be more kind of dissociation. And by fantasy, I'm just picking as examples the Pharisees as a group who are very concerned with purity, moral and physical. The Essenes, who are the group who live in the Qumran community and produce the Dead Sea Scrolls, are more concerned with, and this relates to climate change, I guess, with another world, which is another reality. and that this reality trumps the reality that we are in. And it's not just a different kind of worldview, but it's a totally different world. It's the world you see in the book of Revelation in the Christian New Testament as well, where all sorts of battles are being waged. But at the end, God will triumph. And if life is looked at from that context, really what you do now doesn't matter very much. Because in the end, God, and from a Christian point of view, there's this promise that this earth will pass away and there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And that is the rationale that a lot of American evangelical Christians have for not being very bothered about climate change, because they are already to an extent inhabiting that other world and taking very literally to heart the promise that this world is passing away anyway. And the way they read that is, who cares? Why should we do anything? So those are those two understandable, but you can see if you follow them down a particular to their extremes, perhaps unhelpful ways of using one's faith to respond to a threat that one is confronted with.
Thank you. I can't see any more questions. Emil and David, do you have any more questions?
Oh yes, one on climate change, I think. I heard a talk on climate change and that was very, very impressive, I must say, and urgent. And the first reaction, the first question was, what's the point in me doing something about it if China isn't going to do anything about it? So the call was for everyone to take individual action, but the response was, what's the point in taking individual action? Because you've got, I don't know how many million people in China that won't be taking that action. How do we change that viewpoint?
That may be an excuse. That may just be the person is lazy, or more likely it's a sense that a lot of us have with the climate narrative that there's no point. What can you do? It's too big. My own view is that there's two approaches. One is that you try and show people how what they do makes a difference by pointing to real life examples of where small things make a big difference. I mean, I was preaching on this the other Sunday, when you think about, you can invert this idea that if 2 factories in Britain stop producing fertilizer, suddenly there's no CO2 and there isn't any food on the shelves. That a small thing can cause a disaster. Well, equally, a small action may also be able to be transformative. So I think anything that kind of looks at this, certainly in my own faith tradition, and I think it's true of a lot of faith traditions, this idea that the small can act not just in its vicinity, but to transform something in ways that we don't fully understand much more widely. And part of the nature of faith is to trust that that is the case. I think the other way is to go in at the level of personal spirituality and to say, well, who knows whether what you do makes a difference or not, but you are required to live in this way by your faith beliefs and your tradition. You are required for its own sake and as an end in itself, morally, to behave like this. And asking kind of utilitarian questions of what difference would it make is perhaps not the thing to be focusing on, first of all. It's about how can I live well and as best I can. So starting, valuing what is small. And I think all our faiths, I think that's an insight from all faith traditions, is to look at the small and hear the small voices and to honor those and to keep honoring those against, in a context where there's kind of massive juggernauts and maybe 2 or 3 dominant voices, and that's particularly the case as we've been seeing on the internet at the moment, just to keep treasuring what is small.
Brilliant, thank you.
Any more questions? Emil, David?
There's none here.
Well, just a little comment. You don't have to be a faith member to take individual responsibility of your own life. The change starts with you. In mental health, I have seen people saying, I haven't got anyone to live for. What is the point? And the answer is, you are responsible for your future self.
Yeah.
You're not always going to be like this. You will have a future if you decide to, and you will live better in that future.
That's really helpful. Yeah. And there's something about seeing a future and having hope that is really, really important part of this. Because if the climate change narrative is too destructive, then hope goes out of the equation and people find it hard to act. I have seen a couple of hands waving with questions, actually.
I've got a gallery view. Stephen, do you want to go?
Yeah, so my original question was about how do you hold religious leaders to account for a kind of pre-modern doctrine? But I think from what we've said this afternoon, I think I'd prefer to ask, what future is there for faith? Because as we go through these discussions and arguments, it seems to me that they chase each other. You know, in a way, somebody who belongs to a community that doesn't accept what they believe is the answer to that, to suddenly to say, well, I no longer fit in this community. Are we saying that personal spirituality is more important than belonging to a faith community?
I think you're asking that in relation to the research I mentioned towards the end about how kind of very marked tribal aspect to one's faith may lead one in certain directions. And it certainly does seem to be the case that leads one, there's more research on hostility to minority groups, which seems to be quite strongly connected with that, and inversely related to a more personally appropriated spirituality. What I think is that I said it's a kind of continuum, and that there are real benefits in the social cohesion that faith offers, but that these are some of the costs and the darker side. So I think it needs to be managed, and I think people need to be aware, just as they're becoming more aware about the risks of power imbalance and abuses within faith communities. They need to understand the kind of social factors that are involved as a community starts to become cohesive, and the context with which it finds itself, and to glory in the benefits and to be alert to some of the dangers of that. And I think splitting off, so I have, you know, partly carelessly set as if they were different, personal spirituality from community-based faith, and but actually they need to be integrated. So there's something about, and that this relates to the, you know, you start small, you can make a difference. Paying faith leaders, I think faith communities need to be small enough for this, that the leaders know their congregations and members well, that they can attend to the personal appropriation of the transcendent reality of each member of that community, can attend to the corporate identity and the loving care that that community will give for each other, and to keep that community outward facing so that it doesn't become too intratextual, but is open to insights from the world outside, including, you know, being able to enrich its own theology and traditions by incorporating some of those insights into its worldview. But to do that, as we all know in our personal lives, to be open, you have to feel confident and not persecuted or under threat. So we also have to acknowledge that's a big ask for certain faith communities in the particular point in the journey that they're at. But I think the aspiration is for this integration of the individual with the whole community, with the spiritual, with the more kind of basic social justice aspects of that community, and with keeping a robust, distinctive identity, but that is nevertheless hospitable to the world outside and is able to interact with that, so that there's kind of mutual respective interchange going on. And that's a very big ask, but I think that's what we need to aspire towards. And that would be my understanding of what faith brings at its best. I don't think you can throw it out with, you will lose. Just being aware of the dangers and particular difficulties that faith communities have is actually important in building them up. I don't think it's an argument for saying we don't need faith and we don't need faith communities anymore.
Sorry, just to round that off very quickly, do you know of any communities where religious leaders have been reprimanded or held to account for any pre-modern doctrine that they may have given?
I think not from within the faith community itself, as far as I know. Clearly, when people are doing things that put vulnerable individuals at risk through this, then they get reprimanded from outside. And then very often, you know, certainly in the Church of England, what seems to happen is the reprimand starts outside, and then people hold their hands up to poor practice. What I think we have, and this is why I think theology is not an add-on. I think what we've not done very well is in the churches, and I can only speak for the churches because that's my own faith, and we've done it to varying degrees, but generally not very well, is negotiate that move from modernity to post-modernity, where we are on the margins metaphysically, and yet we have deep truth to share, but we are stuck with pre-modern baggage. And to say something's pre-modern isn't to rubbish it. There's wonderful riches of pre-modernity which need to be discovered, but there is very little in the way of critical, I think, discernment between the riches of pre-modernity and some of the things that weigh us down. So I don't know of any cases. That's your question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. It's been really interesting and very enlightening to hear from you. And a pleasure actually to see you, Eve. I think the term being used nowadays is e-meet. So it's been great to e-meet you.
Nice to be here, yeah.
And yeah, it's been a pleasure to see you and hear from you as well. Very interesting talk. And we've had an amazing line of speakers this morning as well. And what a great way to end it. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop recording now.